Hello, my name is Wade Sokolowski, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I want to welcome you to our online lecture series in honor of our nation's 250th birthday. Blue and Gray is excited to sponsor 30 lecture videos by Dr. Laurie Schiller, Adjunct Professor of History retired at Northwestern University. Follow Laurie as he takes us on this incredible journey to the early period of our nation's history. In addition to Laurie's lectures, if you want to experience firsthand by visiting some of these historic sites, please check out our award-winning guide, Into the Revolutionary War, by historian Burt Dunkerley. And of course, the centerpiece of what Blue and Gray is known for, our fabulous series of sponsored tours led by distinguished historians and battlefield experts. To learn more about the Revolutionary War and other education programs, such as our battlefield tours and Blue and Gray's initiative to expand the interpretation at many of these historic sites through the emplacement of information panels, and more importantly, how you too can become a member of Blue and Gray, please visit our website listed below the screen at the end of this video. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube as well. Once again, thanks for watching.
Welcome to the Blue and Gray Education Society's lecture series on the American Revolution, part of our Rev War 250 project. I am Laurie Schiller, retired adjunct professor of history from Northwestern University. This project includes this online class, as well as the in-person battlefield tours led by historians and symposia that we hope to hold in historic areas that will combine tours with lectures. You can check our BGES.org website for further information on events. You can also purchase our award-winning and Explorer's Guide to the American Revolutionary War, where you can find information on how to tour America's Revolutionary War battlefields and historical sites on your own. This is the first topic, introduction and the context of the Revolution. Now join me in a journey to better understand how we founded this nation. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026, the disasters of the New York campaign, George Washington's retreat across the Jerseys to the Delaware River, and the magnificent victories at Trenton and Princeton that followed, modern scholarship has come to recognize the complexity of the events of the period. While we are taught in school about the founders, we rarely hear about the actions of the common people who understood the nature of liberty and their rights differently in different sections of the colonies, but who united to drive events in which the elite often found themselves as followers, not leaders. This was not a revolution from the top. That being said, the final documents of the period, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, were created by a small elite and were certainly not supported by the majority of Americans in 1787. At the end of the course, we will examine this second American Revolution, which grounded the Republic with enduring documents and paved the way to the future. This course is organized as a series of topics rather than as a comprehensive of the entire period. The syllabus is posted on BGES website. Refer to the general readings listed there to get a fuller understanding of the entire time period. Each of these topical classes has 3 lectures, and they will be between 30 and 40 minutes. So this is lecture number 1, the introduction of themes. Now, at Northwestern, I often taught American Civil War classes, and I've always included a PowerPoint with lots of period photos. But unlike my Civil War classes, there aren't too many photos of the Revolutionary War era, but here is one. This is Samuel Downing, aged 102, taken by the renowned Civil War photographer Matthew Brady in New York in 1864. Samuel died at 105 in 1867 and was purportedly the last surviving veteran of the Revolutionary War, although at least one others survived him, according to the book on Brady, in which I found this. The American Revolution is, probably next to the American Civil War, the most studied, misunderstood, mythologized, and exploited event in American history. The huge question of this entire course is to understand how Americans, for the most part, moved from the general rejoicing by British America, and especially New Englanders, at the ouster of Catholic France from North America by the combined British and colonial forces to Declaration of Independence, a widespread revolt that would put an end to British control in what would become the United States. What possessed these, for the most part, everyday common Americans to stand up to professional European soldiers? How did they win? And how did a few key American leaders lead a second revolution to create a true national government under the Constitution? Indeed, on July 21st, 1788, New Hampshire rushed through the ratification of the Constitution so as to be the ninth and deciding state, beating out Virginia and New York, two of the three largest states, for the honor. Finally, Yankee Doodle went to town and stuck that feather in his cap. The American Revolution has been examined and examined again by some 9 or 10 generations, not only of Americans, but of Europeans and others who have sought to take something away from it that may or may not be there, and in the process, often to buttress a cause that they held dear in their time. The most recent case is the Tea Party movement in the United States, which has drawn its own particular interpretation out of the revolution while ignoring facts which are inconvenient. They are not the first, nor will they be the last to do so, as we increasingly see in modern politics on both the right and the left of the political spectrum. While some have tried to examine it from a purely academic standpoint, most interpretations have sought to put the revolution in a broader context with deeper meanings for history and, in some cases, suggesting it has little meaning at all. By and large, Americans of the Revolutionary War period viewed American victories as evidence of God's work and his design for the world. A Protestant minister in Pennsylvania, Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, wrote 2 days after Washington's victory at Trenton, quote, "It is a sign that the Almighty Lord of hosts has heard the cry of the afflicted and sent an angel to help him." This idea of divine approval expressed itself widely in that patriots saw themselves as instruments of a higher power engaged in a noble cause. Those both in America and Britain who supported the American cause also began to articulate American victories as triumphs of Republican freedom and virtue over monarchical tyranny and corruption. Washington becomes not just a brilliant military leader of the Republic, but a moral exemplar of its cause. For some in the Napoleonic era who were fighting against the ancient regimes of Europe, Washington was a hero to be emulated by those struggling for freedom. In the mid-19th century, an interpretation of the Revolution arose that historians call Whig history, written by authors who called themselves liberals after the liberales who fought to free Spain from Napoleon. The liberal idea contained a strong attachment to the ideas of liberty and democracy, with a consciousness of history as a story of the inevitable progress against heavy resistance. In America, the central figure was George Bancroft, who lived 1800 to 1891, who believed deeply that history was the story of the growth of liberty and democracy, and saw the revolution as designed to organize social union through the establishment of personal freedom, and thus emancipate the nations from all authority not flowing from themselves. In Britain, George Otto Trevelyan, 1838 to 1928, took a similar tack but with an English twist. The revolution was not a foreign war, but a struggle for liberty and human rights in Britain as well as in the United States. He agreed with 18th century opposition leaders William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, and Charles James Fox that if America were subjugated, Britain would not long be free, and argued that the American Revolution delivered England from the tyranny of personal rule and arbitrary government. After the Civil War, a war-torn generation gave the revolution a new inspirational meaning, one that would inspire a new birth of freedom, in Abraham Lincoln's words. Since the beginning of the 20th century, we have seen nationalist interpretations of the revolution which embraced patriotism and sacrifice, but which reject change, the opposite of the liberal Whig idea of constant progress. And the debunkers, named after Henry Ford, who famously said in 1916 that History is more or less bunk. It's tradition. We don't want tradition. We want to live in the present. The only history that's worth a tinker's damn is the history that we make today. These anti-historians sought to explode national pieties as erroneous myths and legends, or said that history was simply a series of accidents with no plan or purpose. In 1926, William E. Woodard, the son of a Southern tenant farmer, wrote that Washington was a, quote, stupid, ignorant, greedy, selfish man who combined the vices of a modern businessman, a Southern slave driver, and a Western Indian fighter. Woodward insisted that he was a poor general and owed any success to pure luck. We've even had Marxist materialist interpretations, popular and often incorrect. History then revivals of both nationalist and liberal interpretations. I might add that the A&E production, The Crossing, is based on one of these materialist interpretations written by Howard Fast in 1971. A wonderful production, but based on a book full of historical howlers, imagined conversations, and casual inventions, all rationalized by a relativist argument that history is filled with such alternate versions of the truth. He has General Nathanael Greene stating to Washington, "Our own cause is at its heart a fight against British taxation. In the end, sir, we all kill for profit. The British, the Hessians, and us." Greene and his New England compatriots would have truly wondered at such a statement. One thing for sure, the revolution and its meaning continues to fix the public mind, however you or I may wish to interpret it. What I intend to do in this series of lectures is to blend all of this together and to give you the best academic view I can. You can decide on your own upon the ultimate significance of the American Revolution for the United States and world history. Well, when we talk about the American Revolution, we are really talking about a double revolution. The first is a story of a young evangelical colonial population living in small communities from New Hampshire to Georgia who seized control of the American countryside, ousted Crown authority, had their leaders declare independence, and then successfully challenged the authority and military might of Great Britain, then the strongest empire in the world. The roots of this insurgency stretch back a century and a half to the founding of the first colonies. But a revolution doesn't begin until there are a sufficient number of people prepared to take up arms against an unelected imperial government that no longer served the common good as they perceived it. In mid-1774, for reasons we shall examine in Topic 3, the moment of revolution occurred for British Americans when reasonably contented colonies suddenly decided to resist the representatives of the King government with violence, if necessary. The British Crown obliged, and for the next 9 years, until separation was granted under the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the first revolution played out. The newly liberated 13 colonies then struggled to find their way under the Articles of Confederation until it appeared in the winter of 1786-87 that the American experiment would collapse amid the chaos of rebellion and violence. There was little sense of national identity, and Congress had been given little power to create one. Washington wrote in the fall of 1786, "I am mortified beyond expression when I view the clouds that have spread over the brightest morn that ever dawned upon any country." He urged James Madison to persuade the Virginia legislature to issue a call for a reform of the federal government. That summons was issued in the fall of 1786 and called for a meeting at Philadelphia in May of 1787. Over the next few months, a few determined leaders now consciously dragged the leaders of 12 colonies, Rhode Island didn't send any delegates, towards a federal constitution. This second revolution, a revolution from the top, for most colonists did not support it, created the framework for a new nation that Americans would eventually grow into. They literally changed the conversation from one of simply getting liberty and independence from Britain to creating a new and enduring nation. The final act of that second revolution was the ratification of the Bill of Rights. With hindsight, we can see that this has been no easy task, nor one that will ever be complete, as America will continue to grow and change with the centuries as long as there is an American republic and democracy. We will examine that second revolution in our last lecture. People are fond of talking about turning points when discussing history. If we are examining a limited event, such as a battle, there may be, in fact, one significant turning point that holds sway over everything else that occurred. For example, at the last major battle at the North, Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey on June 28, 1778, the Americans were retreating in confusion when Washington rode up, took command from General Charles Lee, and turned the tide of battle by his actions. As a rule, I find that fairly simplistic, as even dramatic events such as that tend to have more complex contexts. But when we are discussing much longer and complex events, I don't feel that pinpointing a turning point, however colorful that might be, is useful. In fact, reading about the revolution, you will hear of several turning points, depending on who is writing and what their perspective is. For me, I would like to point out 8 key events that I think are critical in determining the course of the revolution, and that we will discuss as the course progresses. The first is actually an event that occurred nearly 80 years before and was combined with an intellectual movement, the Enlightenment, to provide a philosophical cause for revolution. This is the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England. With Parliament's overthrow of King James II and their assertion that the king's power was limited by the English Constitution, the idea of Britons having distinct rights and liberties was confirmed in the minds of people in England and the colonies. When Parliament decided to levy taxes on the colonies, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764, the colonists, who had only been taxed by themselves before, took this as a direct challenge to their liberties and challenged the right of Parliament to do so. On the other hand, parliamentary leaders and King George III saw Parliament as supreme, and on this sticking point, neither side would budge, come what may. The second event is, like the first, a movement, this time a religious one. The 1741 Great Awakening was embraced by most colonists, whose experience in the colonies was more self-reliant, and they were excited by its greater emphasis on individual experience of the spirit and lessened concern for traditional church organization. As we shall see, it produced a concentration on morality and right behavior, but also fed congregational democracy. The third important point was the Boston Tea Party, and more importantly, the coercive acts which followed in the spring of 1774. Parliament's decision to close the port of Boston and revoke the Charter of Massachusetts drove the people into active rebellion and the literal dismantling of British authority outside of the major American cities. The fourth turning point was the decision to declare independence and leave the empire. The fifth important point, often called the turning point, is the First Battle of Trenton, December 26, 1776. But this was really 3 battles and a partisan war for the next winter. After the disastrous campaigns in New York in the summer of 1776, Washington had lost the greater part of 3 colonies, its most populous city, New York, and 90% of his army. It seemed that a gentle push by the British would be all that was needed to destroy what was left of Washington's army, and the morale of the patriots reached a low that it would never again approach. But then Washington attacked Trenton on the morning after Christmas Day and beat the Hessians, who had not, by the way, been partying, drew Cornwallis into an attack on his fortifications there a few days later, beat him off, and escaped to Princeton, where the Continentals defeated a British force. This was followed by what was called the Forage War, where small groups of militia throughout New Jersey attacked and harassed parties of British and German soldiers as they tried to supply themselves over the winter of 1777 until, in fact, they could barely survive. The British went from confident conquerors to feeling like they couldn't win the war in just 6 months. The sixth turning point was the internationalization of the war in 1778. Following successful diplomacy in Europe by Ben Franklin, John Adams, and others, plus the defeat of Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne at Saratoga, the French, followed by the Spanish, went to war with Great Britain. This forced the British to pay attention to the defense of the home islands and other colonies, especially in the Caribbean, and de-emphasized the war in America. It also gave the Americans access to the French fleet, which would play a key role in the seventh turning point. which is, of course, the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown and the effective end of the war. This, though, was set up by the failure of Cornwallis to secure Georgia and the Carolinas in the war in the South, and the American successes at Cowpens and Kings Mountain, which led him, in fact, to move up into Virginia. Finally, the eighth turning point was a decision by James Madison and others to call a constitutional convention, which resulted in the replacement of the ineffectual Articles of Confederation with the American Constitution. So now let's begin to look at this complex historical event that we call the American Revolution. England, as well as Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, which would comprise Great Britain, was undergoing significant social and economic changes in the 17th and 18th centuries. Certainly, the most powerful factor at work in the 200 years between 1600 and 1800 was economic throughout Western Europe. The freebooting overseas expansionism that had begun in the early 16th century had, by the mid-18th century, developed into a vast system of worldwide trade centered in Europe. Commerce on this vast global scale had given birth to institutions created for its support, such as banks and joint stock companies, which financed and facilitated its growth. When the church decided to allow profit-making on commercial risks, private banks grew up in Renaissance Italy and Germany. As mercantilism grew, states founded their own banks. The Bank of England was established in 1694 as England emerged as a world commercial power. Commerce also generated the wealth that would spur the Industrial Revolution and social revolutions in 1789 France and the 19th century. An intensified demand for manufactured goods created urban workshops and new classes of people who ran and worked in them. These people operated under the new principles of capitalism and mercantilism. The system also spawned overseas factories and colonies, which were hooked into the international system. In its simplest terms, capitalism may be defined as a system of production, distribution, and exchange in which accumulated wealth is invested by private owners for the sake of gain. Its essential features are private enterprise, competition for markets, and business for profit. It also includes a wage system for workers who compete in the market for jobs so that their wage is not based on the amount of wealth they create, but on their market value. Capitalism is designed to encourage commercial expansion to the national and international level with the goal of unlimited profits. The old craft guild system, which was designed to produce the products society needed for a reasonable charge, lacked the resources to compete with the capitalists and was broken. Capitalism rewarded the individual who had the resources to manipulate world markets to his advantage. Mercantilism is often posed as opposed to capitalism, but that is not really true. Mercantilism can be viewed as capitalism by the state. Where capitalism was designed to make individuals rich, the goal of mercantilism was to make the state rich and therefore powerful. Mercantilism, however, had a precedent in the medieval idea that the populace of any particular town and surrounding countryside comprised a community with a common wealth. The well-being of these communities depended on everyone doing what God put them on earth to do. In other words, staying in their assigned social and economic position. And in return, the community took care of its own, even if that meant no more than keeping prices at acceptable levels and the poor from starvation. In the 17th and 18th centuries, mercantilism came to mean that a state's power depended on its actual calculable wealth, expressed in terms of the amount of gold and silver bullion in its possession at any given time. Thus, the state tried to be as self-sufficient as possible, importing as little as necessary while exporting as much as possible. And, as with the town government cited above, the state felt it could impose regulations on how this economic system worked, which included restricting wages to discourage home consumption of goods that were needed for export. The ability of different European nations to practice mercantilism varied. For example, the Dutch, who lacked governmental centralization, could never achieve self-sufficiency and thus favored free trade. The British and French were actually the two nations that had the resources and governmental centralization to enable them to become the most successful practitioners of mercantilism. Mercantilism and capitalism functioned compatibly in the period we are interested in, and using both of them, governments designed new institutions that facilitated the expansion of global commerce and effected what has come to be known as the commercial revolution. Aside from banks, the commercial revolution was distinguished by, first, the creation of a credit system. Second, larger units of business which combined many merchants called regulated companies, such as the merchant adventurers created to control trade with the Netherlands and Germany. Third, then even larger units called joint stock companies, in which people who didn't actually participate in the trade, but simply bought stocks and got dividends were created. Some of these also held charters from the government, granting them a monopoly of trade in a certain area. This led to the establishment of colonies, which were expected to provide raw materials and markets for the mother country. Colonies that were sometimes governed by the stock or the charter company, such as in Virginia or India, and led to the exploitation of vast territories for the benefit of both the company and country, capitalism and mercantilism working together. Governments were thus inspired to increase both industrial production and trade, but at the same time, try to limit their colonies from trading with others, creating state monopolies. This was the theory in any case, and was the expectation of England of its American colonies in the 18th century. The commercial revolution promoted rapid economic expansion, but this had risks, and inflation ruined many an aristocrat and peasant alike, as did loan defaults and economic instability. Since mercantilism was tied up in state power, it was inevitable that the state would end up being involved in the colonial areas in competition with other mercantilist states. Thus, France, England, the Netherlands, and Spain all found themselves at loggerheads around the world from the 16th century on. But the wars that resulted were partly financed by the same commercial capitalists who brought them on to begin with. We'll pick up the story of the competition of these countries in the next lecture.